What Marvel mutants are still missing from Jonathan Hickman's era of X-Men comics? In Part 1, I explored 6 major missing mutants, and today in Part 2, I'll cover 5 more, plus a rundown of some listener favorites nominated in the comments of Part 1 of this series as we dig into the missing mutants of Marvel's X-Men. Today I'll answer 5 more of the most notable missing mutants in this era of X-Men, the Dawn of X, an expanded theory about Moira X's true plans for mutant kind, and of course theories and predictions for what's to come in the Dawn of X. Spoilers will follow for this conversation throughout the Dawn of X as I talk about a bunch of things that have happened since House of X and Powers of 10 kicked off the era way back in summer 2019. Thanks everybody for listening. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. You are listening to Krakin Krakoa. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel or Krakin Krakoa, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps me out a great deal. Without further ado, let's talk major missing mutants. Number 7 on our list, and a big one. I wouldn't say this is like in order of importance because Cassandra Nova is a pretty big deal. She's not the 7th most important, but she is the 7th I'm going to be talking about. Who is Cassandra Nova? Well, in short, she is Professor Charles Xavier's long-lost evil twin that he tried to kill in the womb. Arguably, it was self-defense. Nova is a remarkably powerful telepath and a Mumadrai, aka Charlie's perfect spiritual opposite. It is debatable, I suppose, that Cassandra is in fact a mutant, because while she is basically a twin, in his twin, she's actually created from Professor Xavier's psychic energy. So as to her official mutant status, up in the air. Last we saw Cassandra Nova, well, the last notable story is X-Men Red, in one of the best pre-Hickman X-Men arcs by Tom Taylor, with frequent art by Mahmud Asrar. Nova faces off against Jean Grey and the reformed X-Men Red Squad, and it is, again, basically a battle of hate versus empathy, and by the end of that, Jean Grey actually makes Nova feel empathy for the first time, and she is overwhelmed. Now, shortly thereafter, Cassandra Nova was reportedly jailed in the pages of the Matt Rosenberg-written Uncanny X-Men, which we learn in a conversation that occurs with the current Black King, Emma Frost, and she basically just overhears a general saying, you know, basically, we found Cassandra Nova last night thanks to your information, which implies she is imprisoned somewhere in the United States, but I don't know that we have much more information beyond that as to her current status. Now, what comes next for Cassandra Nova? Well, there's kind of 2 possibilities that probably lead into each other. The first is, and Here Comes Tomorrow, the Grant Morrison story arc that he finished his new X-Men run on in 2001 to 2004. The Grant Morrison influence, again, cannot be overstated in terms of Jonathan Hickman as a creator, and especially in terms of his, the X-Men runs that he has celebrated leading into his time on the title. There's also an extremely strong implication in Morrison's Here Comes Tomorrow that the grown-up future Cassandra Nova, who shows up in this arc, and she's like the leader of the X-Men at this point in time in this kind of apocalyptic future that Morrison and I think it's Mark Silvestri on art depict. In the grown-up version of Nova, she was once the mutant known as Ernst, a younger mutant who debuts in the Morrison era of New X-Men. She looks very old. She has what appears to be progeria, this disease where a younger person can look very old, and she is also great friends with No Girl. Ernst and No Girl are both also mutants who are kind of missing in this era of X-Men as well. I think connecting them to Nova as Grant Morrison intended is something that is very likely, but I think this sort of future and this alternate future is a possibility about where the story could be going. Again, anything that is Grant Morrison related, I think we have to consider, like, Hickman's probably going to want to play with that a little bit, okay? The other strong possibility is that in Moira X's lifelines that we learned about in Powers of 10, I think it was Powers of 10, number 6, there's Homo Novissima. Now, if there was a Cassandra Nova connection here, I think, the reason I think there might be is, one, just because of what the genetic kind of blend between machine and man is called, Homo Novissima, right? Like, it's right there in the name, potentially, that is Nova, Cassandra Nova related. And if there is a Cassandra Nova related connection, I can't imagine Moira would be cool with her bouncing around Krakoa, right? Like, if Moira is in any way aware of this Homo Novissima person who is in her 6th lifeline and basically tried to, like, nullify Moira. You basically tried to say, Moira, we are going to keep you here and absorb you into this dominion, this cosmic galactic intelligence, so that you can never ensure the survival of mutant kind because you'll be outside it in this Dominion. In terms of how we could get there, with Cassandra Nova, it's like she has lain dormant in mutants before. We've seen it with Emma Frost and we've seen it with Bishop in previous X-Men stories. So Nova could already have a presence on Krakoa, kind of building towards this Homo Novissima timeline and just lying in wait. That's a strong possibility as well. Now, there's a ton to this character. I think Cassandra Nova could and definitely easily should get her own overview in her own right. I'm kind of fast tracking here just because she's a major thread that given the Morrison influence, given the fact that she's created a new X-Men and Hickman's adoration for that run and that creator, we're going to see this character. It's really just a matter of is Cassandra Nova going to be resurrected as a mutant part of Krakoa, which is very much up in the air. We haven't seen it done. So that leads us to another missing mutant component, which is the Children of Apocalypse. Now we've got two options here. We've got Holocaust and Genocide, and we've got the Apocalypse Twins. So let's talk about them a little bit. So Holocaust is a character who makes it out of Age of Apocalypse alongside X-Man. And he is around for a while as an Age of Apocalypse cast-off. And then there is an Earth 616 version of the character, not the Age of Apocalypse version, who is named Genocide, who debuts in the Rick Remender run on Uncanny X-Force. And this Genocide is raised by Krakoa and helped by Dark Beast. And we're going to talk a little bit about this Genocide, I think, more specifically, because again, Holocaust makes it out of the Age of Apocalypse timeline, but I don't necessarily expect, and we'll talk a little bit about why this is the case in this coverage, that alternate reality characters are top priority for Krakoan Resurrection. Certainly we haven't seen it that way. So I think instead, Genocide is more interesting to me, because Genocide is very much an Earth 616 character, and again, raised by Krakoa and Dark Beast, another Age of Apocalypse castoff, who we'll talk about here in a second. Likewise, though, so we have Genocide. That is a character who does exist in Marvel, who is the son of an Apocalypse, An Apocalypse. We'll talk about what that means in a second here. But then we also have the Apocalypse Twins, who come from the seeds in Rick Remender's X-Force that were laid, and then ultimately are created and unveiled in the pages of Uncanny Avengers. Now, again, these twins are children of an Apocalypse. That does not mean N Saba Nor. What was the last time we saw these characters? Well, we saw Genocide and Holocaust, or really just Genocide, was ultimately killed by Magneto in the pages of Uncanny X-Men number 10 during a very disappointing Apocalypse Wars crossover. So I don't really see how you'd argue Genocide isn't ready for resurrection. This is a mutant who existed in this Earth 616 and was killed and seemingly has not been resurrected. The Apocalypse Twins, on the other hand, they ranged from Uncanny Avengers number 5 to Uncanny Avengers number 22, and to my knowledge have not been seen or used since. You have Uriel and Iman are the twins here of Archangel and a Pestilence from the Dark Angel saga. During this time, Archangel Warren Worthington actually replaces Apocalypse as the Apocalypse, something I'm hoping to talk about a lot more in a detailed breakdown of the X of Swords handbook that talks a little bit about there being, and I talked about this in my review of X-Men number 13 about N Saba Nur being the 8th Apocalypse of Earth 616. So I won't get fully into the weeds there. But in terms of what's next for these characters, I don't expect it because it might just complicate things, but honestly, Ten of Swords and the Apocalypse family reunion would be a pretty good darn time to give us an update on what's up with these characters. Again, I think we have Genocide, a son of Apocalypse, who is based on Holocaust, an alternate reality son of Apocalypse, and we have these Apocalypse twins who, while not necessarily the children of En Saba Nur, but literally not the children of En Saba Nur, they are connected to the Apocalypse mythos. I think these characters would be really interesting, again, as we explore this new Apocalypse family that is being framed up and made increasingly important in the Hickman-written pages of the Ten of Swords event. So I find these characters extremely compelling. I would like to see them return to Krakoa and get some detail about what's going on with them. Speaking of Apocalypse, we got to talk Age of Apocalypse a little bit here. Now, there are two characters that I'm particularly interested in. There's Sugarman, and then there's Dark Beast. So Sugarman, and I've already covered off a few Age of Apocalypse cast-offs. We had Nate Gray, X-Man, I talked about in the first thing. Obviously, X-Man had the Age of X-Men event leading into House and Powers, but X-Man is a cast-off. That Nate Gray is the version of Cable from the Age of Apocalypse alternate reality, and Sugarman is kind of his own thing. He's not a version of another character, but he's an Age of Apocalypse cast-off who makes it to Earth 616. So we do see this character bouncing around 616. the other one that we see way more of is Dark Beast, who is the version of Hank McCoy Beast, who of course makes it from the Age of Apocalypse timeline to our own, to Earth 616, and it had a role in X-Men history since that time in a number of comics. I mean, again, like in the 90s, of course, there's going to be that post-AOA, let's make Dark Beast a thing, as he leads various villains and it has connection to villains like Mikhail Rasputin in this timeline. But then there's also, like Endangered Species, the series that followed in the wake of Decimation, Scarlet Witch's decimation of mutant kind in the 2000s. Hank McCoy turns to Dark Beast and he's like, hey, got any ideas on how we can ensure the survival of mutant kind? Most recently, we saw Dark Beast in the pages of, again, that Matt Rosenberg written Uncanny X-Men run, which leads up to House and Powers. So in the X-Men run immediately preceding the Hickman era, Dark Beast is majorly integrated into this unit, working with the team. He is ultimately killed by magic, by Ileana Rasputin, when he is phased into a wall, I think is basically what happened there. So I think to our knowledge, Dark Beast is dead. Now, last we saw Sugarman, similar thing. He was found dead actually in this exact same run, just in the very first issue. I think it's in the 2018 relaunch Uncanny X-Men #1. I think Bishop finds him dead. I might have it wrong who actually discovers him. So both these Age of Apocalypse cast-offs are kind of taken off the table. And they're okay, are they up for resurrection, I think is the question. What's next? Well, again, I'm going to go through the handbook. I'm going to go through the things that really caught my eye, I think in a separate video. But the Marvel Ten of Swords handbook does point out that alternate reality and clone mutants may be outside resurrection protocols. I mean, it's pretty clear. It says it was used to resurrect all previously deceased X-Men, except clones and alternate reality versions of existing members, and presumably return Xavier to his own body, which is neither here nor there for this conversation. But as a lot of readers have pointed out, there are clones or clone-adjacent individuals on Krakoa. The Stepford Cuckoos, for example, and Gabi are the most notable examples. Although I suppose the of existing members caveat in the sentence there is somewhat crucial, as there are mild alterations between Emma Frost and the Stepfords, right? You wouldn't consider them exact clones, despite shared DNA, and the same goes for Gabby and Laura Kinney and Logan as various sort of Wolverine entities. That said, Dark Beast might already be in play, if we think about it. Now, he definitely has not been resurrected, but a lot of people, including myself, have theorized that Dark Beast could be an influence in the mind of Hank McCoy, or we could be watching, potentially, the Earth 616 version of our Hank McCoy turning into what we typically associate as Dark Beast. And this is happening in the pages of X-Force, where Beast is making just, the most obviously bad decisions, oftentimes. Although, again, it's not without some nuance. It's not without some, I suppose, argument, in terms of the things he's doing for self-defense and the thinking that can lead a mutant to say, I have to, harm these people to protect our own. And getting into those arguments, I suppose there's more to it than literally just okay, black and white, good and bad. That said, Beast's actions, I would say, in terms of doing a genocide, in terms of what did he do with Colossus? He put him up in front of basically made a scene of saying we're going to arrest all the Russians because they might have Russian ties. I mean, Beast is making very damaging decisions, and I think there's a possibility that Dark Beast is already possessing his mind, already a part of it, already in his head, or just that we're watching him walk down that path. Number 10 on the list, major missing mutants who can come back, Jimmy Hudson. Who is Jimmy Hudson? Well, he's the son of Wolverine from the Marvel Ultimate Universe. His mother is Magneto's ex-wife, for what it's worth, a character who takes on an interesting role after the event of Ultimatum. His relevance to the current era of X-Men and Earth 616 is that Jimmy was one of the surviving Ultimate Universe characters who made it from Secret Wars through to mainline Marvel, a la Miles Morales or Old Man Logan. So Jimmy Hudson very much does become a part of the integrated Earth 616 universe after the death, in quotes, of the Ultimate Universe that occurred in the pages of Secret Wars. Because otherwise, Ultimate Universe versions of the X-Men, there's no expectation that they would be resurrected on Krakoa, at least at this time. Jimmy Hudson becomes kind of an exception to that rule because he did bounce around on Earth 616 as his own separate entity. When's the last we saw Jimmy? Well, he had a consistent role in the X-Men Blue series. Again, this is 2017, 2018. He was captured by Miss Sinister, to be very clear there, and alongside some other Ultimate Universe cast-offs, and he was ultimately found by the original 5 X-Men, the young original 5 X-Men who, again, were sent back in time prior to the Hickman X-Men. Again, like going back to that handbook thing, one of the key things Hickman is clearly doing and made a point of, like editorially and structurally, is removing duplicates, removing versions of characters that are, like basically we don't want 4 Wolverines running around, which as a fan, I 100% agree with. But it does raise these questions about like, well, what are we actually doing with these other characters? I mean, the last we saw of Jimmy Hudson, he was a poison, okay, from Venomized, a 5-issue Venom kind of mini event, and he was in the pages of X-Men Blue as a poison, basically assaulting him as he deserved, because Sebastian Shaw was going to do some damage to the original Cyclops and Jean Grey. Okay, so he was protecting them, but it was debatable even at this point if Jimmy is still even a mutant. He is this kind of symbiote attached Venom thing, and I think he's still that. I don't think that we've seen the character since. So this one's a bit interesting because Jimmy is not a direct clone, and while he is from another reality, I'd argue he's not a direct copy of Wolverine the same way Laura Kinney or Gabby are not. Again, like he's not just the Ultimate Universe version of Wolverine. Like in the case of Old Man Logan, were that character to still be alive, you would say, well, that's an alternate reality version of Wolverine. Jimmy Hudson is not exactly that. I think if you look at just the way the handbook said it, saying no clones, no alt reality versions of characters that already exist, Jimmy Hudson should be up for resurrection. So I think this is a character we could see sometime in the near future and could be added to the Wolverine squad. The bigger question then becomes, does the character actually even need resurrection, or is Jimmy still bouncing around as this weird Venom hybrid symbiote, again, like as a poison, which is not a concept that is heavily utilized in the actual ongoing Venom. All right, here's the biggest one. The Precogs, okay? This is a major one for the Hickman era of X-Men, as we'll get into. I'm going to talk primarily here about Blindfold and Destiny, definitely one that we have talked about a lot in our conversations around X-Men and the post-House and Power scene. But there's also technically Madam Web here, who I know from Spider-Man, particularly Spider-Man the Animated Series, my first introduction to this character, who some readers, I think, mentioned this, and I looked up, and, she is labeled as a mutant. So that's a really interesting one to me, because anytime Madam Web shows up, I'm thinking 90s animated series, I'm thinking that video game Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, and also Nothing Stops the Juggernaut, the best 2-issue Juggernaut story of all time. Madam Web's got a role in that too, so she's got some great Spider-Man moments. It'd be interesting if they brought her into X-Men. But we're primarily going to focus here on Destiny, given her prominence as the arch nemesis of Moira X and the wife of Mystique. Dawn of X readers are pretty darn familiar with Irene Adler at this point. She's easily one of the most compelling mutants in the Dawn of X without showing up really in like a single panel, at least in the present moment. We've seen her referenced obviously in Powers of 10 in Moira's Third Life, and we've also seen her referenced in flashbacks to Mystique, but she is not resurrected. And very famously, Moira has said she cannot be resurrected. That is like the one secret rule of Krakoa, is do not bring back Precogs, but really more specifically, it's like do not bring back Destiny. She's a problem. Blindfold, on the other hand, her name is Ruth Aldine. She's another of the most memorable mutants with the ability to tell the future. She's created in the Joss Whedon and John Cassaday run on Astonishing X-Men and has bounced around in the X-Men and Marvel Universe since then. She strikes up an interesting relationship with Legion, actually, in the very good X-Men Legacy series written by Cy Spurrier. And as we'll talk about, last we saw her was in the pages of, again, that Matt Rosenberg Uncanny X-Men run. So last we saw Ruth, she was sadly committing suicide in the pages of the Rosenberg written X-Men run. Last we saw Destiny, though, was either in House of X or arguably X-Men number 6 through Mystique's memories and shrine. The parting message that Destiny leaves for Mystique that we get in the pages of X-Men number 6 is, when those days come, remember these words, bring me back, and if you cannot, if they will not, then burn that place to the ground. Pretty awesome, pretty ominous. I do love the design here of Destiny's face mask and helmet. The way just Irene Adler is a presence throughout the series, without even showing up, is extremely cool. So let's talk what is next for these characters, because there's a lot to consider. So why would Moira not want Destiny to come back? It's one of the most engaging mysteries of Hickman's X-Men, I'd say. In Moira's Third Life, in this epic confrontation between the two, Destiny and the Brotherhood burn Moira alive because she created a cure for mutant kind. Their message is effectively, don't destroy mutants, use your gifts to find ways for mutants to survive. Okay, To my mind then, if that's what Moira was still doing, really seeking out mutant survival in Life 10 for everyone on Krakoa, why would she still be afraid of Destiny's presence, right? It would seem like she was doing what Destiny would want her to do. There's two answers that spring to mind. Number one, the knowledge of her plan would spoil her plan, therefore mutants can't know or it will never come to pass, right? Like the possibility of the plan will be ruined if you all know what it is because you wouldn't act the way you naturally would, or something to that effect. Or number two, which I prefer, is that Moira's plans run counter to mutant survival, at least in the way that Destiny would like. I think this is the more likely outcome. Not necessarily that Moira is yet again working on a secret cure for mutant kind. I think that would be a little too obvious, but something a little bit deeper. One line I've thought about a ton since House and Powers ended is in the pages of Hickman's work on Fantastic Four characters and into Avengers, there's a line from Valeria Richards to her father, Reed Richards, that says, basically like, okay, we're not going to win. It's time to start figuring out how not to lose. That's her advice. You can't win, okay? And what do you do in that situation? You figure out how not to lose. Moira tells Charles Xavier the dark secret of her mutant lives is that mutants always lose. It makes me wonder if Life 10 is less about figuring out how to finally win and more about figuring out how not to lose. There are several options that could fit into this sort of stalemate stalling approach, but the one I've probably theorized about the most is Moira planning an eventual ascension to the Phalanx, and a mutant ascension as part of one of those galactic intelligences we saw in Powers of 10. If you remember all the conversation around World Mind and Dominion and Titan, all that stuff, right? Moira trying to position mutant kind in some form to adapt to that. It's a literal, if you can't beat them, join them. And I could see Destiny rejecting this outcome as a means of mutant survival because it's not a scenario where mutants win and thrive. So what's next for precognitives? Well, I think a strong possibility is Mystique disguises herself as Professor X, as Magneto, or whomever gets her access, and gets some of this intel about Moira. Maybe she gets into the No Place. Maybe she has a conversation, right? And reveals it to the Krakoan nation. I think that's like Mystique. There's kind of two options for her. One is she sabotages the whole thing by having access to this Nimrod being built and like allowing it to happen, like helping Orcus, helping the Nimrod be built to destroy Krakoa because she's been spurned. But the other option is she actually works with mutant kind, takes this information and says, if I make this public, and you've like withheld Destiny from me, I can fracture Krakoa and I can make something better. And this could create a fractured nation state, possibly a civil war. I think it's borderline 0%. Like there's no chance that we don't see Destiny and probably even Blindfold again, possibly resurrected as part of Mystique's Krakoa Island takeover. I think there's, again, a lot of people are looking for, like, what happens when the X-Men, what happens when the mutants discover the truth of what Professor Xavier is planning? What happens when they discover the truth of what Moira is planning? And there's an implication throughout this that, like, things will go poorly. Like, if they really knew what they were planning, they maybe wouldn't be allied on Krakoa. And I think Mystique could be absolutely instrumental in that because, again, of her connections to Destiny and the fact that she is being absolutely played by Professor X and Magneto, and not well. It's not like they're subtle about this. They keep making her, they say, all right, you'll have earned her resurrection when you do this task for us, but they keep moving the goalposts on her. And again, Mystique, she is not a character to be trifled with in this manner. She is going to react, and I think the reaction is going to create what leads to the resurrection of Destiny and precognitives in the Krakoan nation. So I also do want to cover just very briefly Krakin Krakoa listener favorites from part 1 of the Missing Mutant special. I won't talk about these in significant detail, but I will say there were 5 I pulled away that I thought probably had the most to talk about. The first is Forget-Me-Not, a character that I definitely had forgotten about and don't know much about. And I find so the mutant ability is basically like, if you're not directly looking at him, you forget they exist. It's a really interesting character, and it's also, this character is called out specifically in the Ten of Swords handbook. Like, they go out of their way to talk about Forget-Me-Not, which makes me think there might be some reason for that. Like, this character might have a role to play. So that could be a part 3 potentially on Missing Mutants if people are so inclined. I don't know that a part 3 is coming, honestly. I think like these 2 parts are the main notable mutants that I wanted to talk about, but I did want to kind of cover off on, like, these are the other mutants that people suggested that, if I did a part 3, if people were interested in that and kind of asked for it enough, these would be the ones that probably would be in the discussion, in addition to any others you want to mention here in the comments. We also have in the lower left, there's Justice, who is most prominently known as like the New Warriors in the Avengers. In the middle there with Mr. Sinister, there's Threnody, who's a really interesting mutant. Below that, bottom right, we have Mimic, who is possibly not even a mutant, but who debuts at one of the oldest characters that we could talk about, who shows up in the Stan Lee and possibly Jack Kirby days of X-Men as a character who can basically just take anyone's powers. And then there's Miss Sinister, who again, like just on the clone level, I think we probably rule out. But there is like, again, like it's, I don't know. I don't totally know what to make of Miss Sinister and if she should have a role in this series. But again, like it's a kind of an interesting character to consider given how big a deal Mr. Sinister is in this run and just how interesting the character is in general. So there you have it. Those are the more missing mutants of Krakoa, at least the notable ones. Thanks everybody for listening. I do want to say too, like, thanks to everybody who is suggesting characters to talk about in the comments. Definitely do so here. I will say a lot of the ones that I looked at, they were characters who either have been seen or mentioned in some capacity. Which doesn't mean don't mention them, but it's like there's so many mutants in this universe, and there are so many comics where it like they might just have a brief appearance. Like Dust is an interesting character to me, who again is created back in that Morrison New X-Men run. She technically shows up in House X, right? She's around, she's on the page. Blink, who I love from the pages of Age of Apocalypse and Exiles, is a really interesting character I saw mentioned. She technically is mentioned in a data page as sword fighting Nightcrawler, I think it is, in the pages of Cable. So again, it's like, do I want more from these characters? Yeah, absolutely. But we kind of do know what they are. It's not really a mystery to me, like, if they're around. That said, again, I made exceptions to that myself with, like, Zorn in the first part. So there could be a lot more to dig into with what these characters might be up to. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Comic Book Herald and Krakin Krakoa. Thanks to everybody at patreon.com/Comic Book Herald for supporting the site monetarily. It helps me out a great deal and encourages me to continue making all of these things. I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com, at Comic Book Herald online. Look for the best comics ever in My Marvelous Year podcast for more from me. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.